There's a great deal of confidence for someone to say, well, I am going to decide that George Washington is wanting because he was a slave owner. And therefore, I will condemn him out of category, and I will say his statue should be taken down and his name should be removed from anything in public. All right, first of all, there's a bit of virtuosity in that, because it assumes that there's only one factor in someone's life that counts.
That George Washington was only a slave owner.
Exactly. Second thing is, are you prepared 50 years from now, 100 years from now,
250 years from
or
now,
250 years, to be judged for something that today you don't even notice, that you take for granted? Are you prepared for that? Because that's, in fact, what will happen,
yes,
modeled on what you have established now. And that tends to make people hesitate a bit, and rightly so. Because when Washington is living and thriving in the 18th century, this is a world which doesn't even notice that there's anything peculiarly odd about slaveholding. I mean,
it's the norm.
The world in which Washington is born is still very much a world that conceives of things as hierarchies. That you've got a king on the top, you've got nobles beneath that, you've got commoners beneath that, you've got peasants beneath that, and below that, you've got slaves. Everything's a hierarchy, everything's a pyramid, it all works together, and everybody is born into the place that they occupy for their lives. And anyone who tries to disturb that is a threat to public order, and it's to be treated that way. People took that for granted. That means that when we talked about labor in the 18th century, you really talked about a spectrum that included slaves, and that was at the most extreme end of the spectrum, because slavery was something you were born with as a permanent natal disability. But then there was also indentured servitude and convict servitude, and there was no shortage of indentured and convict servitude in the American colonies. Britain was sending convicts to the American colonies right up until 1775, and the horrors of the convict passage were only slightly less than the horrors of the slave passage from Africa. Then you have ordinary laborers, then you have mechanics and artisans. In other words, you have a great mass of people who work with their hands. That's the big distinction in the 18th century. People who work with their hands, people who don't. People who don't are gentlemen, nobility, and so on like that. It's just seen as, everyone who works with their hands is seen as being on this same spectrum. They're just at different points in the spectrum. The 18th century will change that. The 18th century changes it for two reasons. One, the 18th century is the age of enlightenment, when people think differently about nobles and kings and no longer think of the universe as a rigid hierarchy. No, now the universe is all men are created equal. That is a revolution in and of itself. There's a whole different way of understanding the relationships of human beings from time out of mind.
These were ideas that Washington's contemporaries, Thomas Jefferson and others, had been gestating in and then brought forth into the world at the time that...
This is Washington's milieu. This is an era of transition, when we stop thinking about mechanics and artisans and laborers as being simply in the same category with slaves. No, now you actually begin to have this possibility that someone who works with their hands can improve themselves and move into a different category. And no one is a better example of that than Benjamin Franklin.